When describing the culture of the state of Missouri, then Congressman, now Senator Roy Blunt once wrote, "If you've ever driven to or through Rolla, you may have noticed the billboard just outside of town congratulating you on finding your way to the middle of everywhere." But there you were, very near the actual center of the state and close to the population center of the United States, just 60 miles away in Plato, Missouri, in neighboring Texas County. If Rolla holds a legitimate claim to being the middle of everywhere on the Cartesian map, the state of Missouri has long claimed the legitimate status of being a microcosm of everywhere on the political map. Chalk it up to a demographic profile that parallels the nation in every statistical category, from average family income to the proportion of union membership to the percentage of African Americans, right down to our blue coasts and our ruby red heartland. In a very real sense, we are America, drawn to scale, of course. Indeed, an argument can be made that St. Louis is more like Baltimore than it is Kansas City, and Kansas City is more like Denver than it is St. Louis. North Missouri is a lot like Iowa, and it's hard to find anywhere more like the Delta South than the Boot Heel in Missouri. And the Scotch-Irish heritage of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee is easily found in the Ozarks. But as much as Missouri is the same as the rest of the United States, we will focus on, at least during the beginning of this course, those things that distinguish Missouri from the other states and the United States as a whole. Good morning. Thanks for coming early today. I want to talk today about Missouri politics. This is the first lecture, and we want to get you acquainted with what kind of state Missouri is. Many of you are taking this class because you're transfer students, and so you're going to have familiarity with other sorts of states, and it's important for us for you to understand what kind of state Missouri is, especially with respect to politics and institutions. Much has been said about Missouri being a bellwether state or a microcosm of the United States, because Missouri has only been wrong in presidential elections twice, once in 1956 and once in 2008. In 1956, we voted for the Illinois senator, and in 2008, we didn't vote for the Illinois senator. Missouri in 1956 voted for Adlai Stevenson, and in 2008, Missouri voted for John McCain. But other than those two mistakes, as people say, Missouri has been correct. And the argument is Missouri is a microcosm of the United States. Missouri has rural areas, Missouri has urban areas, Missouri has suburban areas. Missouri is a little bit like the United States in many ways. So Missouri has been seen as a microcosm, and we talk about Missouri's impact on presidential elections in that regard. So my question for you basically is, what color is Missouri? If you had to pick, what color is Missouri? No, Joni, it's not brown. I know we've been in a drought, but no, that's not your choices. Your choices are, is Missouri red or is Missouri blue? What color is Missouri? Carly says Missouri is a red state. Why? Missouri is a red state because Missouri voted for John McCain in the last presidential election. Now, nobody is saying Missouri is a blue state. What I don't want you to think about, although you're thinking about it now, is Missouri being a red or a blue state with respect to Democrats and Republicans. When we talk about presidential elections, we're talking about red for Republican and blue for Democrats. I want to get past that, and I want to talk about ideology. We will talk about political parties and partisanship later in this class, but right now I want to talk about ideology and give you a definition. But what I'm going to start with now, and I want you to remember throughout the entire course, is Missouri is a red state. Missouri is a red state, and Missouri always has been a red state. And when I say red, I don't mean Republican. I mean Missouri is a conservative state. Missouri is a conservative state, and Missouri always has been a conservative state. And if you project into the future and look at immigration patterns, Missouri probably will always be a conservative state. But when I say conservative, I don't mean Democrat or Republican. I mean conservative in the sense of ideology. And I want to give you a definition. It would be a coherent, set, A coherent set of values. Coherent set of values mean set of values that go together. That's what the coherent part is. A coherent set of values about society, the economy, and government. What do people in Missouri have as their ideology with respect to these three things? Society, the economy, and government. And the idea is that Missouri has a consistent political ideology. And when we say ideology and give it this definition, what does an ideology give you? It gives you a way to explain why society, the economy, politics are the way they are. An ideology also gives you a way to evaluate or give you a standard on how to measure how things are the way they are. And finally, an ideology gives you an orientation. It gives you a sense of belonging. We share an ideology. We belong to a group of people who understand the state, understand politics, society, and government in the same way. And the ideology of Missouri is conservative. And I will emphasize this over and over again. Missouri has a conservative political ideology regardless of Democrats and Republicans. Missouri is a conservative state and probably always will be a conservative state. Okay, let's move on to what does this mean? What does the definition of conservative mean? When I say Missouri is a red state, when I say Missouri is a conservative state, what does that mean? Well, it starts pretty simply. Missouri means, conservative means limited government. What kind of government do you want in Missouri? Well, the most important thing is it's a small government. Missouri is based fundamentally on this conservative principle of limited government. Now, we'll talk next class period, 2 class periods from now, about what does it mean to have a limited government. We'll go over the big picture today, but conservative means limited government. And when we talk about limited government, it's important to talk about what does that mean in terms of where is government limited. Certainly with respect to the economy in Missouri. The government of Missouri has a hands-off or laissez-faire relationship with the economy. Missouri's government is limited, especially with respect to the economy. Government interference is more limited in Missouri than it is in other states, and we'll talk about relative states in a little bit. Limited government also with respect to society. And here we have to pause for just a second because Missouri, like all states, changes. There is a group within the conservative realm that would be hands-off everything. Hands-off government in terms of society, hands-off what you can do as an individual. But as most of you probably know, Missouri's government has actually gotten a little bit bigger, not smaller, with respect to society. We will talk later about abortion regulations. We will talk later about the gay marriage amendment. We will talk a little bit later about the stem cell initiative and referendum that was considered and discussed in the state of Missouri. In all 3 of these examples, the limited government of Missouri that we see with respect to the economy has changed, and the government of Missouri has actually gotten bigger, more regulations with respect to these sorts of social issues. And yet, even though government has gotten bigger in this regard, it is nonetheless conservative. And we'll talk about how that works in just a little bit. So when we talk about conservative, the first thing we want to talk about is a limited government. Another way to talk about conservative is to talk about taxes and their relationship to services. Now, who likes to pay a lot of taxes? John doesn't like to pay a lot of taxes. Well, who does? So when we talk about Missouri being a conservative state, it is important to remember that Missouri is a low tax, low service state. What that means is, compared to other states, you pay less money in taxes. And as a consequence, as compared to other states, you have lower services. Now, it's important to break this down into two parts. Range of services and level of services. And these are two different things. What services does government provide? Carlos, roads. That's right. Government provides roads. John? Police, fire. The government provides education. Governments provide a wide range of services. Now the question is, where does Missouri's range of services compare to the other states? Now I'll tell you in advance, this is a trick question. So where does Missouri sit in comparison to the other states? More services with respect to range or less services with respect to range? All right, when you tell people it's a trick question, nobody wants to answer. All right. The trick is, in terms of range of services, Missouri offers exactly the same range of services that every other state. Missouri has roads, California has roads, Missouri has schools, Illinois has schools, and on and on and on. All states offer the same range of services. The real question is, what level of services do they offer? For example, in higher education, Missouri ranks 48th in spending with respect to education. So we are near the bottom with respect to spending on higher education. With respect to everything else, if you had to pick where Missouri is, because Missouri is more conservative than the average state, maybe not the most conservative state, one would expect Missouri to be towards the bottom. And it's not at 48th in all range, with all level of services. It's around 35th. If you want to look at overall spending of Missouri with respect to roads, with respect to police, with respect to fire, with respect to all state services, Missouri ranks somewhere in the mid-30s. And so when we think about Missouri being conservative, start with limited government, small. Think about the level and range of taxes and services offered by the state of Missouri, and you get a picture of a conservative state when compared to other states. Now, the third thing, which is a little bit boring, which we try not to do, but sometimes we can't help it. You can look at Missouri's Constitution, and we're going to do this again in 2 lectures, but we'll take a short look at it right now and find what's called structural conservatism. Missouri is a conservative state in its very structure. If you look at the Missouri State Constitution, and again, we're going to look at it very closely, you will find that there are limits. Specifically built into the Constitution, limits on taxation. There are limits, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit, on debts, how much debt the state can take on, how much debt the city can take on, how much debt the county can take on. As we'll talk about later, there are term limits on members of the House and members of the Senate in the General Assembly, all built into the Constitution, all as a way to maintain the conservative nature of the government in the state of Missouri. And the last thing also has to do with the legislature. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit later. Missouri has what's called a part-time legislature. They're in Jefferson City for about 4 months, for the first from January to May, and then again from January to May. So it's about 9 months over the span of a 2-year cycle. Part-time legislature means they are in the community. A part-time legislature means they are your neighbor. A part-time legislature means they're not in Jefferson City full-time. The fact that they're part-time means they can do less damage when they're in Jefferson City. All of these elements are built right into the Missouri State Constitution. All of these elements reflect Missouri's overall conservative nature. So, number one that we learned today, Missouri is a conservative state. Thank you very much. Now, the bigger question is, Joni, why is Missouri a conservative state? And this is where you learn things that most people don't know. So it's worth talking about not just that Missouri is a conservative state, but why. And we'll take a drink. Missouri is a conservative state for basically 5 reasons, some of which are easy to understand. When does Missouri come into the Union? Missouri comes into the Union's first constitution, 1821, as part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And what is the key element of the Missouri Compromise? If you had American government, or if you had American history, then you should know the Missouri Compromise. Carly, slavery. That's exactly right. Missouri comes into the Union as part of the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri is admitted to the Union as a slave state and Maine is admitted to the Union as a free state. Now, I don't want to overly focus on the issue of slavery, but if you did a map of the pre-Civil War slave states and did a map in 2010, 2011, 2008 presidential elections and measured ideology, there's a great correspondence between the original slave states in the South and the conservative ideology. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So basically, Missouri comes into the Union in 1820 as a conservative state. The second element has to do with geography. And here I don't mean physical geography like caves and rivers and karst topography and that sort of thing. Mainly we want to talk about migration, and we'll talk more about this next time as well. But the migration patterns for the state of Missouri at its infancy in the early 1800s into 1820, into 1821, and the time of the Constitution, is Southern. There are conservative elements in the South, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the more conservative elements are in the South, and Missouri's migration pattern is from the South. Where did the people come to from Missouri? They came from Kentucky. They came from Tennessee. They originally came from Virginia and Georgia. There is definitely a Southern pattern of migration. Those Southern immigrants to Missouri brought with them conservative values. But it's more than just the migration of the Southern individuals. It's also the founding fathers of the state of Missouri. That first Constitution in 1821 was written by Southerners. And those structural elements in the Constitution, many of those elements date back to the original Constitution. The founding fathers who wrote the Constitution brought with them conservative values that were instilled in the Constitution. And many of those elements are in the Constitution of 1945 that we still operate under. So the slavery is the first part. Related to the slavery is the Southern migration with respect to geography, but those aren't the only reasons. We also want to talk about religion. It's hard for most students to understand this, but the question is, what 2 religions were most predominant in Missouri at the time of its founding, 1820, 1821? Any guesses? John? No, it's not Catholic, but if you're from St. Louis or Jefferson City, you probably think so. Number 1, Joni, that's right, Baptist. Number 1 is Baptist. Number 2 is Methodist. The 2 most predominant religious denominations at the time of Missouri's founding were Baptist and Methodist. Now, I'm not going to argue that Baptists and Methodists agree in everything. Every denomination has its differences, but there is one thing that makes Baptists and Methodists fit together, and that is individual responsibility. Both denominations believe that people should be responsible for themselves. And I guess the best way to think about it is this. Paul, if you're in trouble, who should take care of you? First, your family, that's right. And second, your church. Third, your community. Last, and maybe not ever, would be government. The notion of individuals being responsible for themselves is an undercurrent of both denominations in the Baptist and Methodist. So who should take care of you? You should take care of you. And who shouldn't be responsible for taking care of you? Government. It's not an aspect of the denominations, but it's an offshoot of these religious denominations and their beliefs as they're translated into the founding of Missouri. Now, let's fast forward, just jump ahead and get out of the history. What are the two fastest growing denominations in Missouri now? Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, and also the Assemblies of God, headquartered here in Springfield. Now, I'm not going to say that the Latter-day Saints and Baptists and Methodists and the Assemblies of God agree on denominational issues or doctrinal issues, but I would suggest that all four, again, believe in individual responsibility. So the conservatism that was present at the beginning with Baptists and Methodists has only been reinforced by the influx or the growth of the Assemblies of God and the Church of Latter-day Saints denominations in the state of Missouri. So that conservatism has been reinforced. We would also talk very much, or importantly, about a historical event. For lack of a better word, I'm going to put history. And I'm going to put the asterisk. Now, when you're taking notes, you write down an asterisk, and then 3 weeks later, you're studying for an exam, and you ask yourself, why did I put that asterisk in my notes? And the answer is always because it's important, but you never remember why it's important. So let's see if we can remember why this one is so important. Something very important happened in Missouri in 1850. In 1850, the state of Missouri went bankrupt. Prior to 1850, the state of Missouri had made loans to railroads. And in 1850, the railroads defaulted on those loans. Now, technically speaking, this is a 100-level class, but we won't get into this. The state can't go bankrupt. We just keep raising money and run into debt. But the state of Missouri in 1850 effectively went bankrupt, and it wasn't until 1903, 53 years later, that Missouri got back into the black. So the bankruptcy of 1850 has a lasting effect on the government. Now, normally I get the wrong answer here, but we'll give it a try. Carly, what happens when you bounce a check? Yeah, I know. You pay a penalty and say, no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, when you bounce a check, you're not supposed to ever do it again. Missouri in 1850 goes bankrupt and takes 50 plus years to get back into the black. We are not going bankrupt again. So, how do we respond to this bankruptcy in 1850? We are stingy with $1 in the state of Missouri. We are very fiscally conservative. We talk about taxation limits, we talk about debt limits, we'll talk about the Hancock Amendment later, we'll talk about all of the financial aspects of the Constitution, all of the legislation that limits the power of government, whether it's the state or the county or the city, to go into debt and somehow manage to go bankrupt. This was a very hard-learned lesson, and it's one that's not soon forgotten. And again, this is something that most people don't realize, that in 1850 the state went bankrupt. So, why is Missouri conservative? Slavery, geography, religion, history, and there's one more thing, and I always save it for the last because it's the biggest word. Missouri is a conservative state because of apportionment. Now, I am famous for my map of Missouri. And if that doesn't look like Missouri to you, we put in the arch. So now everybody recognizes St. Louis, and now we know it's the state of Missouri. Apportionment is the dividing of the state into legislative districts. And so basically we're looking at dividing the state into legislative districts. That's the definition of apportionment. Up until the mid-1960s, right around 1965, every county in Missouri was guaranteed one representative. Every county in Missouri, up until about 1965, was guaranteed one representative. Now, this is where you reach into your backpacks and put on your thinking caps and ask yourself, well, What is he trying to get at? What does he mean here? All right, let's go slow. Up until 1965, every county in Missouri was guaranteed one representative, regardless of, Carlos, John, Joni, population, thank you. Regardless of population, every county in Missouri was guaranteed one representative regardless of the number of people who lived in that county. In some counties, there are more cows than there are people, and yet they were guaranteed one representative. Now, who is overrepresented then? If all of these underpopulated counties are guaranteed one representative, who is overrepresented in the House? And the answer is rural areas. Rural areas, farmers, agricultural interests, these are the parts of the state that are overrepresented. Now, it is not quite an oxymoron, and I don't want to offend anybody, but have you ever met a liberal farmer? Agricultural, rural, small-town Missouri values are conservative values. And when you take this package, slavery, Southern migration, religious denomination, bankruptcy in 1850, plus the dominance of rural interest in Missouri, this adds up to a conservative state. John? Yes, this has changed since 1965, but if you think about the state of Missouri, you have an urban population here in Kansas City and an urban population in St. Louis, and while these areas have gotten more representation, when we talk about the Senate, when we talk about the legislature, you'll see that this rural apportionment scheme, while not true for the House, is still fairly true. Rural areas are overrepresented, but that's a good question, and we'll definitely come back to that. So, Missouri is a conservative state. Missouri is a red state. Now, do we elect Democrats to the House, Democrats to the Senate, Democratic United States senators and House members, Democratic governors? The answer is yes. But they are not all classically liberal Democrats. The Democrats that get elected statewide in Missouri in particular tend to be on the conservative side because Missouri is a conservative state. Color scheme, Missouri is a red state. Missouri believes in limited government. Missouri believes in low taxes. Missouri believes in low services. Missouri's Constitution structurally is built to reinforce and enforce the conservative ideology of the state. Why is that the case? Slavery, geography, religion, history, and apportionment. Questions? Okay, if there's no questions, then we'll stop for today. And we'll start with political culture, closely related to ideology, but just a little bit different. So thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.